Howdy, y'all. It is Wednesday, February 10th, um, 2021. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you're staying healthy. There's a beautiful day today. It's going to get dark and rainy for the next couple of days. Oh, well. We're still in winter. Hope you guys are faring well. Hope you're getting through this. I'm almost done grading the first essay. So, have a few more days of patience. I'm going to sign the second essay today. I'll put that up on the assignments. We'll be writing about a film that would be coming out early 1930s. It's a talkie, folks. They're groundbreaking films that started a new genre, new way of looking at things. We're in the Depression. Remember, I was talking about last week. We're coming out of the Roaring 20s. No booze, and then we get smack right dab into the Depression, right when they legalized booze again, and no one could afford it. So movie theaters had to scramble, and they had to figure out how to keep people going to the movies who were unemployed, losing their houses. They couldn't pay their rent, feed their kids, but they wanted to get their money for movies. And so I had talked about this last week or the other day. They came up with these genre films that were popular with the masses. Screwball comedies, which we would call kind of rom-coms now, romantic comedies, same thing. Musicals with Fred Astaire, fantasy material. People wanted to live a fantasy because reality was right outside the door and it wasn't pretty. Monster movies, Frankenstein and The Mummy and the Werewolf, because fascism was storming through Europe and we didn't know how to fight it, but we could sure fight Dracula. All it took was a stake through the heart, or the werewolf, we could take him on with a silver bullet. Anyway, so those are popular. So I'm going to sign a couple of those films to write about for a second essay. Look for it. I'll put it on there later tonight. And you'll have a week to do it like last week. And then I'll keep it open for another 3 days or so. And when you're late, you'll get a couple points knocked off. And then after the deadline, the late deadline, you don't hand it in, you won't get any points. Don't hand it in. But so you'll have plenty of time. That's a lot of times to watch the film, enjoy the film, try to enjoy it, take your notes and look at what the things I'm talking about. I'll post that in the assignment today. What to look for when I talk about what is a theme, multiple themes. Well, it could be a lot of things: loyalty, love, lust, betrayal, unrequited love is a great theme. Meaning you love somebody, but you can't have them, or they won't have you. That's a great theme. In monster movies, it would be the outsider, misunderstood. Frankenstein's monster didn't have a choice. He was made by Dr. Frankenstein. He didn't have a choice in his life. He's made from dead parts, yes. He didn't ask to be made from dead parts. And because his brain came from a bad source, he had a messed up brain. Not his fault. He wasn't born that way. He was brought to life that way. He didn't have a choice. None of us do, really. Anyway, and so those stories are timeless. So there's a ton of themes when you look at these movies. Not just, everybody wants to be in love or everybody's happy. Those aren't really themes. Those are part of the project, but like in a screwball comedy, what's really going on here? Well, it's a lot of stuff. Class warfare, meaning the rich versus the poor, the haves and the haves not, people who are born born into wealth and didn't lose anything in the Depression, and other people who had to work and struggle every second. So how does that go? How do they go together in one movie? How do you put those themes together in one movie? A classic, if you're guys learn how to write screenplays, you'll take a screenwriting class, and the first thing the teacher will tell you what creates a great screenplay: conflict. Without conflict, you have a pretty boring story. So what you do is you have your characters, whoever they are, and you put obstacles in front of them. If it's a love story, the obstacle is the person doesn't want you like you want them. And there's an obstacle. They're getting married to somebody else. That's an obstacle. If it's Frankenstein's monster, the obstacle is you can't help but be this huge, strong monster who could kill pretty easily. And the whole town is trying to find you and hang you and burn you. That's an obstacle. And so you have to figure out how to get your character out of those conflicts and those obstacles that constantly are making life pretty hard. Um, Gangster films, which were really popular during this time because of gangsterism, rose because of prohibition. And all of a sudden you can make money off selling. It's like drugs now. It's like selling illegal booze. And so that's what really started gangsters here in America. And it wasn't the Italian mob like it became later. It really didn't have an ethnic thing to it, although it could be some ethnic groups like Irish, Catholic, and stuff were definitely bootleggers and other people trying to get a leg up in a culture that pressures you down. I mean, why do you do something illegal that you might have to go to prison for? You're pretty desperate to get a leg up and to have a good apartment, a nice car, whatever. But what came with the gangsterism was violence, and that's the obstacle. The law doesn't like it. They're after you. You're constantly looking over your shoulder at who's coming for you. And it could be other gangsters. It could be the police. It could be the IRS. That's who came after Al Capone. They finally got him on tax evasion. One of the biggest gangsters in the history of gangsterism. Killed a lot of people, not himself, but he hires it done. He finally was brought down by not paying his taxes. And they sent him off to Alcatraz, which he died out there. So, it's good. It's everybody has good and bad in them. Even Mother Teresa doubted her faith. She did, folks. Towards the end, she was not the believer she was in the beginning because she saw too much poverty in India, too much death. And she started questioning her own faith. And that was Mother Teresa. And if Mother Teresa could question her own faith, that means anybody has doubts. And that's what makes a good film, doubts. If you just want to see happy things happening to good people, that's going to be a boring story. So the films I'm going to assign for you to write about are a couple pre-code films. Remember I talked about 2 weeks ago or so about the Hayes Censorship Commission came out about 1934 or so. And he was there because the Catholic Church said Hollywood had gotten out of hand. Fatty Arbuckle story. Hope you guys watched that little documentary. And it looked like Hollywood was a new Sodom and Gomorrah. In a way it was, but also you could say that about Wall Street. You could say it about a lot of big, huge corporate entities that a lot of money's coming through. And so they started the code, and the code was very strict, and you had to get a seal of approval for your film, and it couldn't have a lot of stuff. For example, it could not have. You could look it up on Wikipedia what the code said you could do, what you couldn't do. And some things you couldn't do, and you don't see it in any films for the next 30 years. You will not see it, hopefully, in any film was, for example, if there's going to be violence, it has to have a purpose, like an armed robbery, and the person who commits the violence is going to have to go to jail or get killed at the end, because they can't let the perpetrator get off. And so the violence has to have a justified ending. And as you well know, in this world, that doesn't often happen. There's a lot of people out there doing violence that get away with it. You never see a bullet hole. You'll hear a gunshot. Someone will hold their chest. They fall away. There's no blood. There's nothing. They didn't show gunshot wounds like we do now. That's all we do show now. We love a gaping wound, lots of ooze coming out. You couldn't have a kiss that lasted longer than 3 seconds. 3 seconds, folks. They used to have somebody standing there with a stopwatch right off camera. When the lead actors and actresses kiss, click the stopwatch, 3 seconds. Click, it's over, break it up. They felt that any kiss that went longer than that was going to suggest that these people are going to have sex. And if they're not married, they don't want to depict that. So essentially what they're saying, folks, if you kiss somebody for longer than 3 seconds, you will probably have a baby in the next 9 months. That's what the theory was. You can't ever see a married couple. You can't see their bedroom unless they're dressing for dinner, not in their underwear, folks. No naughtiness. And they have to the bedroom has to have 2 separate beds and a table in between. That was part of the code. Even though they're married, they're not sleeping in the same bed. And if one of them sits on the bed and the other's present, that person has to have at least 1 foot on the floor. That's part of the rules. If you take your foot off the floor, that means you're inviting that person to come over and have sex with you, evidently. And this code went all the way up into the mid 60s until the code that we have now, which is the rating code, rated R, PG. I'll talk about that later. When that came into effect in the 60s. But this code lasted 30 years. And people, the directors had to adhere to it, but they found very clever ways to work ways around it. They could depict sex without showing it. It's all inferred, and it could be very sexy that way. Now, there's not much sexiness to it, in my opinion, because they just show everything now. Who cares? There's no holds bar. People will have sex in the bathroom, at the nightclub, and there seems to have very little meaning to it. But directors in the 30s and 40s and 50s had to couch their sexuality in a clever way, and they did that. You had to be clever to get it around the censors. And some great movies that are very highly sexually charged, and nobody takes their clothes off. Nobody's in the same room together, but we know what's going on because the director was very clever and the actors to infer the sexual desires of the characters. So, but these movies I'm going to assign for FSA number 2 are pre-code. And what that means is there's some sexual tension for sure. There might be some violence, absolutely. And they don't have to take it back. They don't have to explain it. They don't have to hide it. But it's very mature content. They act like mature adults. And a lot of times the pre-code movies, and I've seen a lot of them. It's not all about having sexual shenanigans. A lot of it has to do with alcoholism, drug addiction, poverty, suicide, and that was all frowned upon after the code came in. They didn't want to have people seeing the reality too much. That movies are supposed to take you out of reality. And so that's what they're there for mostly. And so these films of the Depression era were there to take you out of your misery, of not being able to feed yourself, pay your rent, but you could go in and have a good time for 2 hours and kind of forget all your troubles. Um, until you had to deal with them as soon as you went outside the theater. So that's what the essay number 2 is going to be about. I'll sign it later. You'll see. Watch the film, write the essay. I'll give you some shout outs to how to write the essay. And a lot of you have already told me that you've got the little book, How to Write About Movies, Writing About Movies. It's going to help. Please get it. Read chapter 1. Read chapter 1 and 2. Do it now. The film I want to talk about today, because we've come out of the Depression. The president has established, Franklin Roosevelt established these federal funding programs to help build highways and bridges, buildings, put people back to work. He also gave money to the arts, and Broadway. New York actors were given sometimes a stipend to live on now to produce art. Can you imagine the government supporting art? They do that in most countries, folks. And so things were kind of looking up. And this is before it all came crashing down for World War II. That's all that I do the war years next week. SA3 will be in those era. But today I'm going to talk about a film that is an iconic masterwork by a young man named Orson Welles, who directed this film called Citizen Kane when he was 25 years old. And it was a game changer. What I'm trying to do with the films you guys are seeing is show you the kind of progressive, game-changing movies. Even in the pre-code movies, I'm going to give you those set a precedent with clever direction, camera work, performance, script, all the stuff I'm looking for you guys to look at. The first film, the silent film I sent you, set a huge precedent of what silent films could do, mature films, adult content. So the pre-code films I'm going to sign will be doing the same thing. And Orson, we have to look at Citizen Kane, and we'll sign it till next week. When you Orson Welles, he was kind of a child prodigy. He was actually touring Ireland as a stage actor when he was like 12 years old, doing Shakespeare, directing Shakespeare. They said he directed Hamlet when he was 4 years old. That's a myth, folks. He could barely walk. But the myth of Orson Welles was pretty well established by the time he made his first movie, Citizen Kane, in 1941. He had been a theater director, successful in New York City. He started his theater company called the Mercury Theater, and he had a pool of actors and producers, and they put on some very forward-thinking plays. They did. He did an all-black version of some Shakespeare plays that were controversial at the time because no one had done that before, and people really looked at it and noticed this young man. And he also had a weekly radio show. And in those days, radio, this is before TV, folks, radio was a huge, powerful tool. and they would put on plays, audio plays. If you've ever heard any audio theater on the radio, they're very, very well done. They have sound effects. It feels like you're right there, and you can visualize it easily. And so in 1936 or so, he decided to do the H.G. Wells story, or War of the Worlds, and he adopted it into a play. And on Halloween, he did a live broadcast of the War of the Worlds, and it sounded like he did it in the way, in the guise of a newscast, like it was actually happening. And you guys know the movie War of the Worlds? And I'm not talking about the Tom Cruise one. I'm talking about, if you've read the book, maybe, or the 1950s version, George Powell, which is a great sci-fi movie. In color, by the way. Essentially, it deals with Martians invading Earth because their planet is dying and they could breathe. We have the same supposed, we don't, folks, but this is then, or H.G. Wells was writing this over 100 years ago, before we really knew the science. We had a similar atmosphere, evidently. And so Martians could live down here. And so their planet was dying. And so they decided to invade Earth and take it over for their own planet. But what are we going to do with all the Earthlings? They're going to kill them all. And that's what they tend to do. And their technology is way superior than ours. They have lasers and flying saucers. We don't have any of that. We got old-fashioned rifles and army tanks that don't do much good against their high-tech stuff. In the movie, we even drop the atomic bomb on them, and it doesn't do anything because they have a force field that protects them. And what ends up killing them all? The common cold. They came to Earth where we're used to the common cold, and because our immune systems have developed over the years, but in Mars, evidently, they didn't. And so their immune system is really, really sensitive, and they could die easily of the common cold. And that's what kills all the Martians. And it's over simply because of the common human cold. Excuse me. So Orson Welles decides to do this program with his Mercury Theater actors, and they do it in such a realistic way. In fact, I'm going to assign you on YouTube. You can see some of it. You can watch the whole thing. I think it's only an hour, but I'm sure you have other things to do. But and if you missed the disclaimer at the very first of the show that this is fiction, this is an audio play, not to be taken seriously, brought to you by the Mercury Theater. Well, if you missed that, and a lot of people did, evidently, they went on the air, and it sounded like a real newscast. It actually sounded like Martians have invaded Washington, D.C. Well, people believed it. People actually believed it. Hundreds of thousands of people listened to the show, convinced that Martians had landed in Washington, D.C. So much so that a lot of people in big cities, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, got in their cars and were heading out of town to try to find a safe hiding place wherever they could. That's right, folks. It was panic. Now, in these times we live in now, it'd be hard to believe that could happen because we're so used to so much evil crap actually happening to us all the time that we kind of take it with a grain of salt. They didn't in those days. They believed. And the medium of radio was that strong. And it was presented in such a way that people really believed it. Now, then you ask yourself, maybe they wanted to believe it, whatever. But they believed it. To the point where supposedly there were some suicides over it. That could be an urban myth. But in the meantime, Orson spent the next year of his career apologizing. So you can see press conferences. I'll show you something to watch on YouTube. You can see it. Um, where he just said, "We're just trying to do a drama, and we didn't know this was going to happen." Well, Orson was a pretty clever guy. He knew how to manipulate people. Well, when Hollywood saw how successful that was, they wanted to go into business with Orson Welles. And so they brought him out to Hollywood and they said, "Well, we want you to make a movie." And he had never made a movie before. But of course, he's a theater man and movies would be a pretty good thing to do. He loved uh, Buster Keaton, he loved Charlie Chaplin, and he'd like to make a movie. He didn't know what about yet. And so he was going to do a couple classic novels. He wanted to do Heart of Darkness. He wanted to do Moby Dick, um, Man of La Mancha, which is, with the, I can't even think of the name of the book right now. It's not Man of La Mancha. That's the musical it was based on, uh, where he goes out and tilts at windmills, the knight, who's kind of got dementia. Anyway, he wanted to do something big, and they said, "Well, those are gonna be really costly. Can you come up with something else besides those kind of classics?" And so he came up with an original story, which with a screenwriter named Mankiewicz, and they came up with a story about a newspaper tycoon. Newspapers were huge in those days, and about the rise and fall of this newspaper tycoon, and it was thinly based on Randolph Hearst, who was a big publisher. He owned 50, 60 newspapers throughout the land. This is long before TV studios were the thing to own. Owning newspapers meant you controlled the media, and newspapers were huge. He owned the San Francisco Chronicle here near us. Randolph Hearst, his granddaughter was Patty Hearst. Maybe you know her, who was a controversial figure when she was kidnapped and held for ransom and turned into a Black Panther revolutionary girl herself. Anyway, Hearst was hugely powerful. He had a mistress in Hollywood, Marion Davies, and so they made this movie called Citizen Kane about a newspaper tycoon who has too much money and with a mistress they wrote this movie up, and the studio said, "Fine, looks good, we'll do it, and you can have anything you want." And Orson Welles goes, "I want control over the whole thing." Remember, folks, he's only 25. And they wanted to be in business with Orson Welles, and they said, "Fine." Well, they lived to regret that. And he and the great cinematographer Greg Toland changed cinema history with that film. Whether you like the film or not, it doesn't matter. It's a complex, adult, mature, interesting tale of wealth, of loss, loneliness, trying to buy fame and trying to buy love, and so many more other things. So I'm not going to give it all away yet because I want you to watch it next week. But I'll talk about that then. So that's Orson Welles. He came out of it. Hearst was so powerful, he caught wind of this movie and he decided to try to kill it. There's a Netflix movie right now. It's pretty good. It's called Mank. It's out right now. It's brand new. Gary Oldman plays one of the screenwriters of Citizen Kane, and it's how he wrote it and how Hearst went after him to try to kill the movie. It's pretty well done. It's on Netflix right now, called Mank, M-A-N-K, because that was his nickname, short for Mankiewicz. the movie came out, people were taken back by the movie because it was so ahead of its time with its use of flashbacks and phony newsreel footage. And yes, it's in black and white, folks. Sorry. Um, music, camera position. Nobody's seen camera positions like this. Same thing with deep focus. You guys are going to read about it. I want you to look at some of this stuff. I'm not going to tell you everything because I need you to kind of do some of the work yourself. But him and Craig Tolan did this amazing job of cinema that hadn't been seen before. Yes, he was copying stuff from the silent era. He loved John Ford. He copied a lot of stuff from John Ford. But in the meantime, he was creating new cinematic tropes that became really famous and people still use it to this day. Um, the public was a little confused by the film because it was almost like too smart for the general public. You had to really follow the story because it's all over the map. It kind of died. Randolph Hearst said that we will not allow this movie to be advertised in any of our newspapers. That helped kill it. That's a lot of newspapers with no ads. And also, the week they released the film was the week they bombed Pearl Harbor. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and kind of took the air out of the premiere of Citizen Kane. We had other things on our mind, like a world war. Later on that year, it was nominated for a couple of Academy Awards. It won one award for Best Screenplay Writing. And Orson shared it with Mankiewicz. And the film kind of died until in the 1950s, the French started writing about it in a magazine called Cahiers de Cinema, which is essentially notes on cinema. And they took our cinema very seriously. They as an academic thing, not just as a pleasure thing or entertainment. And they wrote deeply about this film, Citizen Kane, and it kind of resurrected it. And then they started showing it on college campuses, and it became the masterpiece it is to this day. Through the lens of history. Sometimes you make a movie and people just don't get it. That's kind of how this was with this. Anyway, that's my lecture on Orson Welles. Orson had a great, interesting life. I've read so many books about Orson. I love him. Do I love all his movies? No. He never stopped wanting to make the next movie. He couldn't deal with studios. He was not easy to deal with. So he got most of his film financed through European markets, and he had to piecemeal some of his films together, and like Macbeth and so many more. And he was trying to make movies up to the day he died at 70 years old of a sudden heart attack. He was working on a new screenplay. Anyway, he never gave up. And the word genius is bantered around. You could put it on him and kind of you could take it to the bank. We'll not see his like again. He was also his own worst enemy. But that's a little brief thing on Orson Welles. I'm going to find a documentary for you guys to look at. Look for that on Canvas. Look for this assignment for the second essay on Canvas about these pre-code 1930s movies, and that's what you're going to be doing this week, watching all this good stuff. Aren't you lucky? And on that note, keep working hard, keep at it. I was impressed with a lot of the essays, and that's saying a lot because it's hard to impress me. Anyway, Keep up the good work. Keep thinking about movies on a deeper level. Keep analyzing and asking why. Why do the characters do what they do? Why is the camera in the position it is? Why is the music doing what it's doing? Why is the director doing what he's doing? You don't have to be an expert on this stuff, but I want you to look at it like you are and like you know. Next week, I'm going to, besides talk about World War II, I'm going to go through some terminologies. What is a director? What's he do? What really do they do? What is a cinematographer? What do they do? What does the person who does the music? I mean, it's a lot of things go into making a film, and the film you see is completely done. But how do they get there? And so it's our collective art form, and I'm hoping it's to make a comeback after this pandemic is calmed down. We can go back into movie theaters because I think that's a good way to watch movies personally, and maybe you do too. And on that note, keep up the good work, and remember, everything is cinema.